The morning sun painted the sky in soft colors as Rachel stood in front of the mirror, her hands shaking slightly as she touched the pearl necklace that belonged to her grandmother. Today was the day she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. Outside her window she could see the park where in just a few hours she would walk down the aisle to marry David, the man who made her laugh every single day. The venue looked like something from a fairy tale. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows under the old oak trees that had stood in Millfield Park for over 100 years. The morning dew still sparkled on the grass, and wildflowers that Rachel had picked herself decorated every surface. She had chosen this outdoor setting because it reminded her of the place where David had first told her he loved her, during a picnic 3 years ago. In another room, David was struggling with his tie for the third time. His best friend Jake was trying to help, but David's nervous energy was making everything more difficult. He kept checking his phone, not for messages, but to look at the photo of Rachel that he had set as his wallpaper. In just a few hours, she would be his wife. The thought made his heart race with excitement and joy. The guests were already starting to arrive. Cars filled the small parking area near the park entrance, and people in their finest clothes walked carefully across the grass, trying not to sink their heels into the soft ground. Rachel's mother, Patricia, was everywhere at once, checking that the flowers were perfect, making sure the photographer knew where to stand, and greeting relatives who had traveled from far away to be there. The photographer, a kind woman named Lisa who had been recommended by a friend, was already capturing the little moments that would become precious memories. She took pictures of Rachel's grandmother's old wedding dress hanging carefully in the sunlight, of the rings sitting in their small velvet box, and of the happy chaos as everyone prepared for the ceremony. David's father, a quiet man who rarely showed his emotions, was wiping his eyes as he helped his son get ready. He remembered his own wedding day 40 years ago, and how nervous and excited he had felt. Now, watching his son prepare to start his own family, he felt that same mixture of joy and pride all over again. The weather could not have been more perfect. There was a gentle breeze that kept everyone cool, and not a single cloud in the bright blue sky. The local weather forecast had predicted rain, but instead nature seemed to be celebrating along with them. Birds sang in the trees above, and butterflies danced among the wildflowers. Rachel's younger sister Kelly was the maid of honor, and she had been helping with wedding preparations for months. She knew how much this day meant to Rachel, and she wanted everything to be absolutely perfect. Kelly had arrived early to make sure all the decorations were in place and that the small details Rachel cared about were exactly right. The local pastor, an elderly man who had married many couples in the same park over the years, arrived with his Bible and a warm smile. He had met with Rachel and David several times over the past few months, helping them write their own vows and talking about what marriage meant to them. He could see the genuine love between them, and he was honored to be part of their special day. As more guests arrived, the park filled with laughter and conversation. Old friends who had not seen each other in years were reuniting, and family members were sharing stories and catching up. Children ran around between the chairs, their parents calling after them to be careful not to mess up their nice clothes. The wedding cake, a simple but beautiful 3-layer creation made by Rachel's aunt, sat on a table covered with lace that had been in the family for generations. Next to it were mason jars filled with lemonade and sweet tea, because Rachel and David wanted their wedding to feel relaxed and welcoming, like a big family gathering. David's grandfather, a man who had been married to his grandmother for 60 years before she passed away, sat in the front row with tears already forming in his eyes. He was thinking about his own beloved wife and wishing she could be there to see this beautiful day, but he also felt her presence somehow, in the love that surrounded them all. The music began softly in the background, played by a friend of Rachel's who had brought her guitar. The gentle melodies floated through the air, adding to the magical feeling of the day. Everything was falling into place exactly as Rachel and David had hoped and planned. Rachel's bouquet, made of white roses and baby's breath with touches of greenery from the park itself, sat waiting for her in a vase of cool water. She had chosen simple flowers because she believed that the most beautiful things in life were often the simplest ones. The same philosophy had guided all of their wedding planning. In the distance, the small town of Millfield was going about its usual Saturday business. The local diner was serving breakfast to customers who had no idea that one of the most beautiful weddings of the year was about to take place just a few miles away. Life in small towns moved at a different pace. And that peaceful feeling was exactly what Rachel and David wanted for their wedding day. The ring bearer, David's 5-year-old nephew Tommy, was practicing walking slowly while carrying the small pillow with the rings tied to it. His mother kept reminding him not to run, but Tommy was so excited to be part of the wedding that he could barely contain his energy. His serious expression as he practiced made all the adults smile. As the ceremony time approached, guests began taking their seats on the white folding chairs. The front rows were reserved for immediate family, but Rachel and David had specifically asked that there be no assigned seating beyond that. They wanted their wedding to feel inclusive and relaxed, where everyone felt welcome and comfortable. The photographer was capturing all these precious moments, knowing that years later, Rachel and David would look back at these photos and remember not just how they looked, but how they felt on this perfect day. She had photographed many weddings, but there was something especially sweet about this one. Perhaps because of the obvious joy and love that everyone shared. Rachel's dress, a simple but elegant gown that she had found at a small bridal shop in the next town over, hung perfectly as she made her final preparations. She had chosen it not because it was the most expensive or the most elaborate, but because when she put it on she felt like herself, just the most beautiful version of herself. As the time for the ceremony drew near, everyone could feel the excitement building. This was going to be a day that everyone would remember forever, a celebration of love that brought together two families and created something new and beautiful. None of them could have imagined that their perfect day was about to become even more special, in a way that would touch hearts far beyond their small gathering in the park. The stage was set for what everyone believed would be a lovely, traditional wedding ceremony. The sun was shining, the flowers were blooming, and love filled the air. In just a few minutes, Rachel would walk down that aisle, and their new life together would officially begin. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and perfect in every way. 20 miles away from the peaceful wedding preparations, a very different kind of gathering was forming along the interstate highway. The Thunder Road Veterans Club had been riding since dawn, their motorcycles creating a steady rumble that echoed across the countryside. These were not ordinary bikers out for a weekend ride. They were men and women who had served their country, and today they were on a mission that meant everything to them. The group leader, a weathered man named Bull, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, checked his watch as he led the procession down Highway 34. They were headed to Riverside Cemetery, about 15 miles past Millfield, where they would honor a fallen brother. 22-year-old Corporal James Wilson had been killed in action just 2 weeks ago, and his body was finally coming home for burial. The Thunder Road Veterans Club had a sacred tradition. Whenever a service member was laid to rest, they formed what they called a honor ride. Their motorcycles would escort the funeral procession, providing a protective barrier of respect around the grieving family. They had done this ceremony dozens of times, and each one felt as important as the first. Bull's own bike, a massive Harley-Davidson that he had bought with his disability payment after losing his leg in an IED explosion, carried American flags that fluttered proudly in the wind. Behind him rode 49 other veterans, each carrying their own stories of service and sacrifice. Some had served in Vietnam, others in Iraq and Afghanistan. A few had been in Desert Storm, but all of them understood the weight of loss and the importance of honoring those who had given everything. Among the riders was a woman named Rosa, whose son had been killed in Iraq 5 years ago. She rode a smaller bike, but her presence was just as powerful as any of the men. The Thunder Road Club had become her second family after she lost her boy, and participating in these honor rides helped her feel connected to other military families who understood her pain. The sound of 50 motorcycles traveling together was impossible to ignore. Cars on the highway pulled over to let them pass, and many drivers waved or held their hands over their hearts when they saw the military flags and patches. The bikers rode in perfect formation, 2 by 2, maintaining a speed that was both respectful and purposeful. As they approached the Millfield exit, Bull noticed something unusual in the distance. Through the trees that lined the highway, he could see what looked like a gathering of people in a park. The sun was reflecting off something white, and he could see cars parked in a neat row. His curiosity was sparked, but he knew they needed to stay on schedule for the funeral service. However, as they got closer, Bull could see more clearly what was happening. It was obviously a wedding. White chairs were arranged under trees and people in fancy clothes were walking around. The sight made him think of his own daughter's wedding 3 years ago, one of the happiest days of his life. He had walked her down the aisle in his dress military uniform, prouder than he had ever been. The other riders had noticed the wedding too. Some of them were pointing toward the park, and Bull could see smiles on the faces visible under their helmets. There was something beautiful about stumbling across a celebration while they were on their way to mourn. It reminded them that life continued, that joy and sorrow existed side by side in the world. Bull made a quick decision to take the exit that led past the park. It would only add a few minutes to their journey, and something was drawing him toward that scene of happiness. Maybe it was because they spent so much time dealing with sadness and loss that witnessing joy felt important. Or maybe it was just human curiosity about the lives of others. As the long line of motorcycles rumbled down the smaller road that bordered Millfield Park, the wedding guests began to notice them. Some people turned their heads at the sound, while others seemed nervous about the approaching noise. Bull could see that the ceremony had not yet started, but people were clearly getting ready for it to begin. The park was even more beautiful up close. Bull could see that someone had put a lot of love and effort into decorating the space. The flowers looked like they had been arranged by hand, and everything had a personal homemade feel that reminded him of simpler times. This was not some fancy, expensive wedding at a hotel. This was a real family celebration, the kind that his own parents might have had 50 years ago. As they rode slowly past the park, respecting the speed limit and trying not to disturb the celebration too much, Bull noticed something that made him signal for the group to slow down even more. Sitting slightly apart from the other wedding guests, in a wheelchair near the edge of the gathering, was an elderly man wearing what looked like a military cap. Bull squinted to get a better look, and his heart began to race when he realized what he was seeing. The cap had military insignia on it, and the way the old man sat straight and proud despite being in a wheelchair suggested he was a veteran. Bull had spent enough time around military men to recognize the bearing, the way they carried themselves even in their old age. The other riders had noticed too. Rosa was pointing toward the elderly man, and Bull could see her saying something to the rider next to her. Behind them, more of the club members were slowing down and looking toward the wedding with increased interest. They had all seen what Bull had seen, but there was something else that bothered Bull about the scene. The elderly veteran was sitting alone, somewhat separated from the main group of wedding guests. He seemed to be struggling to see over the people standing in front of him, and no one appeared to be paying attention to his difficulty. Whether it was intentional or just an oversight, the old soldier was being left out of the celebration. Bull felt a familiar fire building in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he saw a veteran being disrespected or ignored. He had dedicated his life after the military to making sure that those who had served were treated with the honor they deserved. The Thunder Road Veterans Club existed for exactly this reason, to stand up for military men and women who might otherwise be forgotten. He raised his hand to signal the group to pull over to the side of the road. The rumbling of 50 motorcycles gradually died down as engines were turned off. Bull sat for a moment, looking across the field at the wedding celebration and the isolated figure of the elderly veteran. He was thinking about Corporal Wilson, whose funeral they were traveling to attend, and about all the other young men and women who had died in service to their country. He was also thinking about his own father, who had served in Vietnam and came home to a country that did not always appreciate his sacrifice. His dad had died 5 years ago, and Bull still regretted not doing more to honor him while he was alive. Maybe that was part of what was driving him now. The other club members were waiting for Bull's decision. They trusted his judgment completely, and they knew that whatever he chose to do would be the right thing. The funeral was still an hour away, and they had built some extra time into their schedule. They could afford to stop for a few minutes if there was something important to be done. Bull looked one more time at the elderly veteran sitting alone at the edge of the wedding celebration, and he made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved. He turned off his motorcycle completely and started to remove his helmet, signaling to the others that they were about to do something unexpected. Bull walked slowly across the grass toward the wedding gathering, his motorcycle boots making soft sounds on the morning dew. Behind him, the other members of the Thunder Road Veterans Club followed at a respectful distance, their leather jackets and patches catching the sunlight. As they got closer to the celebration, Bull could see more clearly what had caught his attention from the road. The elderly man in the wheelchair was indeed wearing a military cap, and Bull's trained eye could now make out the specific details. It was a Vietnam veteran's cap, with service ribbons and pins that told the story of a long military career. The old soldier sat with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, maintaining the dignity and bearing that never left men who had served in combat, even decades later. Bull estimated the man to be in his 70s, probably around the same age his own father would have been if he were still alive. The veteran's face showed the weathered lines of someone who had seen difficult things and lived through challenging times, but his eyes were still bright and alert. He was watching the wedding preparations with interest, but from his position at the edge of the gathering, he was clearly having trouble seeing everything that was happening. What troubled Bull even more as he got closer was realizing just how isolated the elderly veteran appeared to be. While the other wedding guests were chatting in groups, hugging each other and moving around freely, the man in the wheelchair seemed to be sitting by himself. Bull could not tell if this was by choice or circumstance, but either way it did not sit right with him. The veteran's wheelchair was an older model, the kind that suggested he had been using it for many years. His clothes were neat and clean, pressed dress pants and a button-down shirt that showed he had made an effort to look nice for the wedding. On his lap was a small gift wrapped in silver paper, indicating that he was definitely part of the celebration, not just someone who happened to be in the park. As Bull approached, he could see that the elderly man was straining to look around the people standing in front of him. Every time someone moved, he would adjust his position slightly, trying to get a better view of what was happening at the front where the ceremony would take place. It was clear that he wanted to be part of the celebration, but was struggling with the practical challenges of his situation. Bull stopped about 10 feet away from the wheelchair and removed his sunglasses. The elderly veteran noticed him immediately, and their eyes met across the small distance. Bull saw recognition there, the kind that passed between military men who understood each other without words. The old soldier's eyes moved to Bull's leather jacket, taking in the military patches and insignia that marked him as a fellow veteran. For a moment, neither man spoke. They were sizing each other up in the way that veterans do, reading the signs and symbols that told the story of military service. Bull could see combat ribbons on the elderly man's cap that indicated he had seen action in Vietnam, probably during some of the heaviest fighting of that war. The old soldier, in turn, was looking at Bull's patches and recognizing the markers of more recent conflicts. Finally, Bull stepped forward and extended his hand. "Good morning, sir. I'm Bull Johnson, Army Afghanistan." The introduction was simple and direct, the way military men talked to each other. It cut through all the social niceties and got straight to what mattered, the shared experience of military service. The elderly veteran's face lit up with a smile as he reached out to shake Bull's hand. "Robert Chen, Marine Corps, Vietnam. 3 tours." His voice was strong despite his age, and his handshake was firm. Bull could feel the calluses that came from a lifetime of hard work and the strength that remained even in his advanced years. "Semper Fi, Marine," Bull said with genuine respect. He had served in the Army, not the Marines, but the rivalry between branches meant nothing when it came to honoring combat veterans. Robert Chen had earned his stripes in one of the most difficult wars in American history, and Bull knew the kind of courage that required. "Hooah, soldier," Robert replied, using the Army term with a grin that showed he appreciated Bull's respect. "What brings you and your friends to our little celebration? I heard those bikes coming from a mile away." Bull looked back toward his club members who were standing quietly nearby, waiting to see what would happen. Then he looked toward the wedding preparations, where people were starting to take their seats for the ceremony. "We're on our way to honor a fallen brother, sir. Corporal Wilson, killed in Afghanistan 2 weeks ago. We're riding escort to his funeral." Robert's expression grew serious and sad. "I'm sorry for your loss, son. Too many good young people coming home that way." He paused for a moment, looking down at his hands. "I lost a lot of friends over there in Vietnam. Still think about them every day." Bull nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Every veteran carried the memory of friends who did not make it home, and that burden never got lighter with time. "Yes, sir. That's why we do what we do, to make sure they're remembered and honored." "That's good work," Robert said. "Important work." He looked around at the other club members, noting their respectful behavior and military bearing. Your group seems like good people. Bull followed Robert's gaze and noticed again how the elderly veteran was positioned at the edge of the wedding gathering. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, how are you related to the happy couple? Robert's face brightened again. Rachel is my granddaughter, my daughter's oldest girl. I've been looking forward to this day for months. He paused and looked toward where the bride was getting ready. She's a special young lady and David is a good man. They deserve all the happiness in the world. I'm sure they do, sir, Bull said. Are you able to see the ceremony okay from here? It looks like it might be difficult with all the people standing. Robert's smile faded slightly and Bull could see that he had touched on a sensitive subject. Well, I don't want to make a fuss or ask people to move around for me. Everyone's excited and happy and I don't want to be a bother. I'll see what I can see. Bull felt that familiar fire building in his chest again. Here was a Marine who had served his country with honor. A grandfather who wanted nothing more than to watch his granddaughter get married, and he was worried about being a bother to anyone. It was exactly the kind of situation that the Thunder Road Veterans Club existed to address. Sir, with respect, you've earned the right to see your granddaughter's wedding from the best seat in the house, Bull said firmly. You served your country. You've lived your life with honor, and today should be about celebrating your family. You shouldn't have to worry about seeing around other people. Robert looked surprised by Bull's passionate response. That's kind of you to say, son, but I don't want to cause any trouble. Today is about Rachel and David, not about me. Bull turned to look at his club members who had been listening to the conversation with growing interest. He could see the same feeling in their faces that he felt in his heart. This was exactly why they had formed their club, to stand up for veterans who might otherwise be overlooked or forgotten. Robert Chen deserved better than sitting at the edge of his own granddaughter's wedding, straining to see the ceremony. Sir, Bull said, turning back to Robert, would you allow my club and me to help you get a better view of the ceremony? We have some experience with honor guards and special occasions. Robert looked confused but interested. What did you have in mind, son? Bull smiled and looked back at his 49 club members, who were all watching and waiting for his signal. Just trust me, sir. We'd like to make sure this day is as special for you as it is for your granddaughter. Bull turned away from Robert and walked back toward his club members, his mind racing with possibilities. The 50 veterans stood quietly in a loose group near the edge of the park, their motorcycles lined up along the road like a parade of chrome and steel. Each face showed the same expression Bull was feeling, a mixture of respect for the elderly Marine and determination to do something meaningful for him. Rosa was the first to speak when Bull reached the group. That's a Vietnam vet, isn't it? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Her own father had served in Vietnam, and she recognized the bearing and the cap insignia from years of attending veterans events with him. Marine Corps, 3 tours, Bull confirmed. His granddaughter's getting married and he can barely see the ceremony from where he's sitting. Bull looked around at the faces of his club members, seeing his own feelings reflected in their expressions. I'm thinking we might be able to help with that situation. Jake, a Desert Storm veteran who rode a vintage Triumph, stepped forward. What do you have in mind, Bull? We've got about 40 minutes before we need to be back on the road for the funeral. Bull was quiet for a moment, thinking through the logistics and the potential consequences of what he was considering. They were strangers at this wedding, uninvited guests who had stumbled upon the celebration by accident. But they were also veterans who had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath did not end when they left the military. I'm thinking we form an honor guard, Bull said slowly, working out the details as he spoke. We escort Robert to the front of the ceremony. Make sure he has the best seat in the house for his granddaughter's wedding. The suggestion was met with immediate and enthusiastic approval from the club members. Several of them nodded vigorously, and Bull could see the same fire in their eyes that he felt in his own chest. This was exactly the kind of mission that gave their club purpose and meaning. But what about the wedding party? Asked Miguel, a soft-spoken Navy veteran who usually thought through all the angles before acting. They don't know us from anybody. 50 bikers showing up uninvited might not be welcome, even if our intentions are good. It was a valid concern, and Bull knew it. They could not just march into someone else's wedding and take over, no matter how good their intentions were. They needed to be respectful of the celebration, while still finding a way to honor the elderly veteran who was being overlooked. We approached the family first, Bull decided. We explain who we are and what we'd like to do. If they say no, we respect that and move on. But if they say yes, we give that Marine the honor guard he's earned. Tommy, a young Iraq veteran who was the newest member of the club, raised his hand. What if they're scared of us? I mean, we're not exactly dressed for a wedding. He gestured to his leather jacket and motorcycle boots, which were appropriate for a funeral escort, but might seem intimidating at a family celebration. Bull looked around at his club members, taking in their appearance with fresh eyes. They were indeed a formidable-looking group, with their leather jackets, military patches, and the general toughness that came from military service and motorcycle culture. But they were also good people with honorable intentions, and Bull believed that would come through if they approached the situation correctly. We'll be respectful and professional, Bull said. We'll explain our mission and our connection to Robert. If we handle this right, they'll see us as fellow Americans who want to honor a veteran, not as strangers disrupting their celebration. The plan was beginning to take shape, but Bull knew they needed to move quickly. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to start soon, and once it began, it would be too late to make any changes to the seating arrangements. They had a narrow window of opportunity to make this work. Bull looked toward the wedding gathering where guests were starting to take their seats and the final preparations were being made. He could see Rachel, the bride, in her beautiful white dress, talking with what appeared to be her mother near the front of the ceremony area. This was clearly a close-knit family celebration, and any disruption would be noticed immediately. All right, Bull said, making his final decision. Rosa, Jake, and Tommy, you come with me to talk to the family. The rest of you, stay here and be ready to move on my signal. Remember, we're not here to take over their wedding. We're here to honor a fellow veteran and make sure he gets the respect he's earned. The 4 chosen club members walked across the grass toward the wedding party, their boots making soft sounds on the dewy ground. Bull could feel the eyes of the wedding guests on them as they approached, and he was aware that their presence was causing some concern and curiosity among the celebration. As they got closer to the bride and her family, Bull could see the mixture of emotions on their faces. There was some nervousness, certainly, but also curiosity about what this group of bikers might want. Rachel's mother, a woman in her 50s wearing a lovely blue dress, stepped slightly in front of her daughter in a protective gesture. Bull stopped about 10 feet away from the family group and removed his cap, a gesture of respect that he hoped would set the right tone for the conversation. Rosa, Jake, and Tommy followed his example, standing quietly behind him as he prepared to speak. Ma'am, Bull said, addressing Rachel's mother directly, my name is Bull Johnson, and we're with the Thunder Road Veterans Club. We're sorry to interrupt your celebration, but we noticed that you have a very special guest at your wedding today. Rachel's mother looked confused but less frightened now that Bull had introduced himself politely. I'm Patricia Williams, she said cautiously. What can I help you with? Bull gestured toward where Robert sat in his wheelchair at the edge of the gathering. That's your father, isn't it, ma'am? The gentleman in the military cap? Patricia's expression softened immediately when she realized they were talking about her father. Yes, that's my dad, Robert. He's Rachel's grandfather. She looked back and forth between Bull and Robert, trying to understand the connection. Ma'am, your father is a Marine Corps veteran who served 3 tours in Vietnam, Bull said with obvious respect in his voice. We're veterans too, and we're on our way to escort a fallen soldier to his final resting place. But we couldn't help but notice that your father is having trouble seeing the ceremony from where he's sitting. Rachel stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. You're talking about Grandpa Robert? She asked, looking toward her grandfather with concern. Is he okay? He's fine, miss, Rosa said gently, speaking for the first time. It's just that he's sitting at the edge of the gathering, and with all the people standing, he's having trouble seeing what's happening. We thought maybe we could help with that. Patricia looked toward her father, and Bull could see the realization dawning on her face. In all the excitement and chaos of wedding preparations, she had not noticed that her father was struggling to see the ceremony. The guilt and concern were immediately visible in her expression. What did you have in mind? Rachel asked, her voice showing that she was open to whatever would help her grandfather have a better experience at her wedding. Bull took a deep breath, knowing that the next few words would determine whether their spontaneous plan would work or not. We'd like to form an honor guard and escort your grandfather to the front of the ceremony. Make sure he has the best seat in the house for your wedding. It's a way for us to honor his service while making sure he doesn't miss a moment of your special day. The silence that followed Bull's proposal seemed to stretch forever, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. Rachel and her mother exchanged glances, and Bull could see them processing what he had just suggested. The idea of 50 motorcycle-riding veterans forming an honor guard at their family wedding was not something they could have imagined when they woke up that morning. Rachel was the first to speak, and her voice was filled with emotion. "You would do that for my grandfather? You don't even know us." She looked toward Robert, sitting in his wheelchair at the edge of the celebration, and Bull could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. We know the most important thing about your grandfather," Bull replied respectfully. "We know he served his country with honor, and that makes him family to us. Every veteran is connected to every other veteran by the oath we took and the service we gave." Patricia was looking back and forth between the club members and her father, and Bull could see that she was struggling with the decision. On one hand, this was her daughter's wedding day, and she wanted everything to be perfect and go according to plan. On the other hand, she could see that these strangers were offering to honor her father in a way that would be meaningful and special. What exactly would this honor guard look like? Patricia asked, her practical side taking over. "I mean, we have guests arriving, and the ceremony is supposed to start in 15 minutes. How would this work?" Jake stepped forward to help explain. "Ma'am, we would form 2 lines from where your father is sitting to the front of the ceremony area. We'd escort his wheelchair through the honor guard to a place of prominence where he can see everything perfectly. Then we'd stand at attention during the ceremony as a mark of respect," Tommy added. "We do this kind of thing at military funerals all the time. We know how to be respectful and dignified. We wouldn't do anything to disrupt or take attention away from the bride and groom." Rachel looked toward David, her groom, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. He walked over to join the group, his expression showing that he was as moved by the offer as everyone else. "This is incredible," David said, shaking his head in wonder. "Rachel, your grandfather means the world to both of us. If these gentlemen want to honor him at our wedding, I think we should let them." Bull could see that the family was warming to the idea, but he also knew they needed to understand exactly what they were agreeing to. "Ma'am, sir, I want to be completely clear about what we're proposing. We have 50 club members here, and we're all veterans. We'll be respectful and quiet, but we will be visible. This will definitely change the dynamic of your ceremony." Rosa spoke up again, her voice gentle but persuasive. "I lost my son in Iraq 5 years ago. The honor guard at his funeral meant everything to our family. It showed us that his sacrifice was recognized and valued. Your father's sacrifice deserves the same recognition." Those words seemed to clinch the decision for Patricia. Bull could see her imagining how meaningful this would be for her father, who had spent too many years feeling like his service in Vietnam had been forgotten or unappreciated by the country he had fought for. "Yes," Patricia said firmly. "Yes, I think my father would be honored, and I think it would be beautiful." She looked at Rachel and David. "What do you think?" Rachel was already nodding enthusiastically. "Grandpa Robert has always been my hero. He used to tell me stories about the Marines when I was little, and I could see how proud he was of his service. If you can give him a moment to feel that pride again, especially today, then absolutely yes." David was grinning widely now. "This is going to be the most amazing wedding ceremony ever. How many couples can say they had a 50-person veteran honor guard at their wedding?" Bull felt a surge of gratitude and excitement. "Thank you, ma'am, sir. We'll make sure this is done with complete respect and dignity. Your father is going to have the best seat in the house, and your wedding is going to be something special." "What do we need to do?" Patricia asked, her practical side taking over again. "How can we help make this work?" Bull looked back toward his club members who were still waiting by the road. He raised his hand and gave them the signal they had been waiting for. Immediately, all 46 remaining veterans began walking across the grass toward the wedding gathering, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The reaction from the wedding guests was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to see what was happening. Some guests looked nervous, others curious, but everyone was definitely paying attention as the leather-clad veterans approached. Bull quickly addressed the growing concern among the wedding guests. "Folks, my name is Bull Johnson, and we're with the Thunder Road Veterans Club. We're here to honor one of our own, Robert Chen, who served 3 tours as a Marine in Vietnam. With the family's permission, we'd like to escort him to a place of honor for his granddaughter's wedding." The explanation seemed to relax most of the guests, and Bull could see understanding and even approval on many faces. Several people began looking toward Robert with new appreciation, realizing that they were about to witness something special. Meanwhile, the Thunder Road Veterans Club members were taking their positions. Without needing detailed instructions, they formed two parallel lines leading from Robert's wheelchair to the front of the ceremony area. The formation was precise and military in its bearing, with each veteran standing at attention about 3 feet from the next. Bull walked back to Robert, who was watching the proceedings with amazement and growing emotion. "Sir, if you're ready, we'd like to escort you to your place of honor." Robert's voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "Son, I haven't had an honor guard since I came back from Vietnam 50 years ago. I never thought I'd see anything like this again." "You've earned it, sir," Bull said simply. "Today, everyone here is going to see you the way we see you, as a hero who served his country with courage." As Bull began to push Robert's wheelchair toward the honor guard formation, he could see that many of the wedding guests were taking out their phones to capture the moment. This was clearly something none of them had ever seen before, and Bull could sense that they understood they were witnessing something truly special. The wheelchair moved slowly through the honor guard, with Bull walking behind it and the other veterans standing at perfect attention as Robert passed. The elderly Marine sat up straighter in his chair, his military bearing evident despite his age and physical limitations. For the first time in decades, he was being honored for his service in front of his family and friends. When they reached the front of the ceremony area, Bull positioned Robert's wheelchair in the place of honor, directly in front of the altar where Rachel and David would take their vows. From this position, Robert would have a perfect view of the entire ceremony, and everyone else would be reminded throughout the wedding that they were in the presence of a true American hero. As the honor guard took their positions around the ceremony area, Bull could see that something magical had happened. What had started as a traditional family wedding had become something much more significant. It had become a celebration not just of love between two people, but of respect for service, sacrifice, and the values that held communities together. As Robert's wheelchair came to rest in the place of honor at the front of the ceremony, the elderly Marine found himself overwhelmed by emotions he had not felt in decades. From his new position, he could see everything perfectly: the altar decorated with wildflowers, the guests in their finest clothes, and, most importantly, the spot where his beloved granddaughter would soon walk down the aisle to begin her new life. But more than the improved view, it was the gesture itself that moved Robert to his core. For the first time since he had returned from Vietnam 50 years ago, he was being publicly honored for his military service. The 50 veterans standing at attention around him represented something he had thought was lost forever: the recognition and respect that he and his fellow Vietnam veterans had been denied for so long. The tears began slowly, just a dampness in his eyes that he tried to blink away. Robert had always prided himself on maintaining his military composure, even in emotional situations. Marines did not cry, especially not in public. But as he looked around at the honor guard that had formed spontaneously to honor him, his emotional defenses began to crumble. Behind him, Bull noticed Robert's shoulders beginning to shake slightly. He moved closer to the wheelchair and placed a gentle hand on the elderly Marine's shoulder. "It's okay, sir," Bull said quietly so that only Robert could hear. "You've earned every bit of this respect and more." Those words broke through Robert's last attempt at maintaining his composure. The tears that had been threatening to fall now came freely, streaming down his weathered cheeks as 50 years of suppressed emotion finally found release. These were not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, relief, and a joy that he had almost forgotten was possible. Robert thought about his return from Vietnam in 1972, when he had arrived at San Francisco Airport in his dress uniform, proud of his service and ready to be welcomed home. Instead, he had been met with protesters who called him horrible names and spat at him. He had quickly changed into civilian clothes and never wore his uniform in public again, carrying the shame and hurt of that reception for the rest of his life. He remembered the job interviews where potential employers would see his military service on his resume and suddenly become less interested in hiring him. He thought about the decades when Vietnam veterans were portrayed in movies and television as damaged, dangerous, or broken. He recalled the silence that fell over conversations when someone mentioned they had served in Vietnam. as if it were something shameful rather than honorable. But now, surrounded by these fellow veterans who understood what he had endured, Robert felt a healing that he had never expected to experience. The honor guard was not just a gesture of respect for his military service. It was an acknowledgement that his sacrifice had meaning, that his service had value, and that he was worthy of recognition and appreciation. Patricia, Robert's daughter, was watching from a few rows back, and she was crying too. She had spent her entire adult life seeing her father carry the burden of his war experience largely alone. She had watched him struggle with nightmares, with the guilt that came from surviving when friends did not, and with the feeling that his country had forgotten about him and his fellow veterans. Now, seeing her father surrounded by respect and honor on her daughter's wedding day, Patricia felt like a tremendous weight had been lifted not just from Robert's shoulders, but from her entire family. Her children would see their grandfather honored as the hero he had always been, and maybe some of the old wounds could finally begin to heal. Rachel, the bride, was watching from behind a tree where she was waiting for the ceremony to begin. When she saw her grandfather crying tears of joy, she began crying too, though she tried to be careful not to ruin her makeup. She had always known that her grandfather was special, but seeing him honored this way made her realize just how much his service had meant, not just to his country, but to her family. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, one that he had carried since his military days. As he wiped his eyes, he noticed that several of the veterans in the honor guard were also wiping away tears. This moment was meaningful not just for him, but for all of them. They were honoring not just Robert's service, but the service of all Vietnam veterans who had come home to an ungrateful nation. Rosa, standing in the honor guard formation, was thinking about her own father's experience as a Vietnam veteran. He had died 5 years ago, still carrying the pain of his reception when he returned from war. She wished he could have experienced something like this, a moment of public recognition and respect for the sacrifice he had made. Jake was remembering his own grandfather, who had served in World War II and had always been proud of his military service. Jake had joined the Thunder Road Veterans Club partly to honor his grandfather's memory, and moments like this reminded him why that mission was so important. The wedding guests were watching this scene unfold with their own mixture of emotions. Many of them had never really thought about what Vietnam veterans had endured, both during the war and after their return home. Seeing Robert's emotional response to being honored made them realize how much these men had given up and how little recognition they had received in return. Some of the younger guests were taking pictures and videos with their phones, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something historic and meaningful. Others were simply watching in respectful silence, understanding that they were seeing a moment of healing and redemption that had been 50 years in the making. David, the groom, was standing near the altar, and he found himself thinking about his own grandfather, who had served in Korea but had never talked much about his war experience. David began to understand that there were probably many veterans in his own family and community who had carried their service quietly, without recognition or appreciation. Bull stood behind Robert's wheelchair, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond the success of their spontaneous plan. This was why the Thunder Road Veterans Club existed, to ensure that no veteran was forgotten or overlooked. Seeing Robert's emotional response validated everything they did and reminded Bull why this work was so important. As the tears continued to flow down Robert's cheeks, he began to feel something he had not experienced since before Vietnam. He felt proud of his service again. For 50 years, he had carried his military experience as a burden, something that marked him as different and possibly damaged. But surrounded by this honor guard of fellow veterans, he remembered what it felt like to be proud of what he had done for his country. Robert straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, resuming the military bearing that had never really left him, even during his darkest moments. The honor guard had given him back something precious that he thought he had lost forever: his sense of dignity and worth as a veteran and as a man. The transformation was visible to everyone watching. The elderly man who had been sitting alone at the edge of the celebration just minutes before was now sitting tall and proud at the center of attention, surrounded by respect and honor, ready to watch his granddaughter get married from the best seat in the house. As the wedding music began to play, the entire atmosphere of the ceremony had been transformed by the presence of the Thunder Road Veterans Club. What had started as a simple family gathering in a small town park had become something that felt historic and deeply meaningful. The 50 veterans stood at perfect attention around the perimeter of the ceremony area, their leather jackets and military patches creating a powerful backdrop of service and sacrifice. Rachel appeared at the back of the aisle, radiant in her white dress and carrying her bouquet of white roses. But before she began her walk toward the altar, she did something that no one expected. She walked directly to her grandfather's wheelchair, leaned down, and kissed him gently on the forehead. "Thank you for your service." "Grandpa," she whispered in his ear, loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm so proud to be your granddaughter." Robert reached up and touched her face gently, his eyes still wet with tears of joy. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You're going to make a beautiful bride." The exchange was captured by the wedding photographer, who was working overtime to document this unexpected turn of events. Lisa had photographed hundreds of weddings, but she had never seen anything like this. The combination of traditional wedding elements with the military honor guard was creating images that she knew would be treasured for generations. As Rachel began her walk down the aisle, accompanied by her father, the veterans remained at attention, but their eyes followed her progress with obvious appreciation and respect. These men and women, who had seen so much conflict and loss in their lives, were clearly moved by the celebration of love and new beginnings. David stood waiting at the altar, his face showing a mixture of love for his bride and amazement at how their wedding day had evolved. When he had woken up that morning, he could never have imagined that their ceremony would include a 50-person honor guard, or that it would become a tribute to military service, as well as a celebration of their love. The pastor, who had been initially surprised by the appearance of the motorcycle club, had quickly adapted to the new circumstances. He understood that he was now presiding over something much more significant than a typical wedding ceremony. This had become a moment where love, service, and community all came together in a way that spoke to the best of human nature. As Rachel reached the altar and took David's hands, the pastor began the ceremony with words that acknowledged the special nature of the day. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today not only to celebrate the love between Rachel and David, but also to honor the service and sacrifice that have made our freedom and our happiness possible." The wedding vows took on deeper meaning in the presence of the honor guard. When Rachel and David promised to support each other through difficult times, everyone present was acutely aware that the veterans surrounding them had already lived through some of the most difficult times imaginable. When they promised to love each other unconditionally, the example of service and sacrifice represented by the honor guard gave those words additional weight and significance. Bull stood directly behind Robert's wheelchair, and he could see that the elderly Marine was absorbing every moment of the ceremony. Robert's face showed pure joy as he watched his granddaughter get married, but there was something more there too. There was a sense of completion, as if this moment of honor and recognition had healed something in him that had been broken for 50 years. During the exchange of rings, David did something that surprised everyone, including Rachel. He turned toward Robert and addressed him directly. "Sir, I want to thank you for your service to our country, and I want you to know that I will honor your granddaughter the way you honored America, with courage, dedication, and love." Robert nodded approvingly, and Bull could see the old Marine's military bearing strengthen even more. David's words showed that he understood the connection between military service and the commitment of marriage, both of which required sacrifice, dedication, and putting something larger than yourself first. When the pastor asked if anyone objected to the marriage, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, spontaneously, one of the veterans in the honor guard called out, "Hurrah!" in support of the union. The call was immediately taken up by the other club members, creating a chorus of military appreciation that echoed across the park. The sound made Rachel and David laugh with joy, and even the pastor smiled at the unexpected but heartfelt endorsement of their marriage. The wedding guests, who had been somewhat nervous about the presence of the motorcycle club at first, were now completely won over by their obvious respect and genuine happiness for the couple. As the ceremony continued, the photographer moved around the honor guard, capturing images that told the story of this remarkable day. The contrast between the traditional wedding elements and the leather-clad veterans created striking visual compositions, but more importantly, the photographs captured the emotion and meaning of the moment. When it came time for Rachel and David to kiss as husband and wife, the honor guard remained at perfect attention, but Bull could see smiles on many of the faces under the motorcycle helmets and caps. These veterans, who had seen too much sadness and loss in their lives, were clearly moved by this celebration of love and hope. The recessional was unlike anything anyone had ever seen at a wedding. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, the honor guard performed a slow, respectful military salute that lasted until Rachel and David had passed completely through their formation. The gesture was both a tribute to their new marriage and a continuation of the honor being shown to Robert. During the receiving line, many of the wedding guests approached the veterans to thank them for their service and to express their appreciation for what they had done for Robert. Some guests shared stories of their own family members who had served in the military, creating connections and conversations that might never have happened without this unexpected encounter. Rosa found herself talking with Patricia about the experience of being a military family member and the unique challenges and pride that came with having loved ones in service. The conversation helped Patricia understand her father's experience in ways she never had before, and it gave Rosa a chance to share her own story of loss and healing. The veterans maintained their formation throughout the entire receiving line, ensuring that Robert remained in his place of honor, while the guests congratulated the new couple. Their presence had completely transformed the dynamic of the wedding, turning it from a simple family celebration into something that honored both love and service. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began to move toward the reception area, Bull approached Robert one final time. "Sir, how are you feeling?" Robert looked up at Bull with eyes that were still wet with tears, but now they were tears of pure gratitude and joy. "Son, this has been the best day of my life since I came home from Vietnam. You and your friends have given me something I never thought I'd have again." "What's that, sir?" Bull asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "You've given me back my pride," Robert said simply. "For 50 years I've carried the weight of being a Vietnam veteran like it was something to be ashamed of. Today you've reminded me that it's something to be proud of." Bull felt his own emotions rising as he realized the full impact of what they had accomplished. They had not just improved the seating arrangement at a wedding. They had helped heal wounds that had been festering for half a century. As the reception continued in the park pavilion, Bull checked his watch and realized that the Thunder Road Veterans Club needed to get back on the road. They still had a funeral to attend, another fallen hero to escort to his final resting place. The contrast between the joy of the wedding and the solemnity of their original mission was not lost on any of the club members. Bull approached Rachel and David, who were greeting guests and sharing their happiness with family and friends. "Congratulations again on your marriage," he said warmly. "We need to continue on our journey now, but this has been an honor and a privilege." Rachel reached out and hugged Bull, something that surprised him with its warmth and sincerity. "Thank you so much for what you did for my grandfather. This day will be perfect in my memory forever because of you and your friends." David shook Bull's hand firmly. "I don't know how we can ever thank you enough. You turned our wedding into something truly special." Bull looked toward Robert, who was surrounded by family members and fellow wedding guests, all of them treating him with the respect and attention he deserved. "Seeing your grandfather honored the way he should be is thanks enough for us, sir." As the Thunder Road Veterans Club prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. The wedding photographer, Lisa, approached Bull with her camera and a business card. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been taking pictures of everything that happened here today. These images are incredible, and I think they tell an important story." Bull looked at the preview screen on Lisa's camera, where he could see some of the images she had captured. There was Robert's face as he was escorted through the honor guard, tears of joy streaming down his cheeks. There was the moment when Rachel kissed her grandfather before walking down the aisle. There were the veterans standing at attention during the ceremony, their leather jackets contrasting beautifully with the wedding decorations. "These are amazing," Bull said, genuinely moved by what he saw. "Would it be possible to get copies of some of these for Robert?" "Absolutely," Lisa replied. "But I was thinking about something bigger than that. Would you mind if I shared some of these photos online? I think people need to see this story." Bull looked around at his club members who had overheard the conversation. The consensus was clear in their expressions. As long as Robert and his family are okay with it, we'd be honored to have this story shared. Patricia, who had been listening, stepped forward. I think my father would love for people to see this. He spent too many years feeling invisible. Maybe it's time for him to be seen." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "I'll write up the story and post it on my photography website and social media." This is the kind of story that reminds people what's good about humanity. As the veterans began walking back toward their motorcycles, many of the wedding guests followed them, wanting to express their thanks one more time. Children who had been shy earlier in the day were now asking to see the motorcycles and hear stories about military service. The event had opened up conversations and connections that would continue long after the Thunder Road Veterans Club had left. Robert, still sitting in his place of honor near the wedding cake, was surrounded by people who wanted to hear his stories about Vietnam and thank him for his service. For the first time in decades, his military experience was something that brought people closer to him, rather than creating distance and discomfort. As the motorcycles roared to life, creating that familiar rumble that had first announced their arrival, Bull took one last look at the wedding celebration. What they had stumbled upon by accident had become one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. They had set out to honor a fallen soldier, and they had ended up healing an old wound and creating a memory that would last forever. The Thunder Road Veterans Club pulled back onto the highway, their formation tight and respectful as they continued toward Riverside Cemetery. But something had changed during their stop at the wedding. They felt more connected to their mission and more proud of what they represented as veterans. Meanwhile, back at the wedding reception, Lisa was already uploading photos to her laptop and beginning to write the story of what had happened. She chose her words carefully, wanting to capture not just the events of the day, but the emotions and the meaning behind them. 3 hours later, Lisa published her blog post with the title, "Bikers Interrupted a Wedding and What They Did Made Headlines." She included 12 of her best photographs and a detailed account of how the Thunder Road Veterans Club had transformed a simple family wedding into something extraordinary. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first hour, the post had been shared hundreds of times on social media. People were commenting with their own stories about veterans and their families, sharing memories of grandparents and parents who had served but never received recognition for their sacrifice. By the end of the day, the story had been picked up by local news stations. The next morning, it was featured on national morning shows. The photograph of Robert's emotional face as he was escorted through the honor guard became an iconic image that was shared millions of times across all social media platforms. News outlets began reaching out to the Thunder Road Veterans Club, wanting to interview Bull and the other members about their mission and their experience at the wedding. Television producers called Patricia and Rachel, asking if they would be willing to share their perspective on what had happened. Within a week, the story had become a viral sensation. The headline, "Bikers Crash Wedding, What They Did Next Will Restore Your Faith in Humanity," appeared on news websites around the world. The story was translated into dozens of languages and shared in countries where people had never heard of the Thunder Road Veterans Club, but understood the universal language of respect and honor. Robert, who had spent 50 years feeling forgotten and overlooked, suddenly found himself receiving letters and emails from people around the world. Veterans from other countries shared their own stories of homecoming difficulties. Young people wrote to thank him for his service and to say that his story had inspired them to appreciate the veterans in their own families. The Thunder Road Veterans Club began receiving requests to provide honor guards at other events. Families who had elderly veterans wanted to give them the same kind of recognition that Robert had received. The club's membership grew as other veterans heard about their mission and wanted to be part of something meaningful. Rachel and David's wedding photos became some of the most famous wedding images ever taken. But more importantly, their marriage began with a foundation of understanding about service, sacrifice, and the importance of honoring those who had given so much for others. 6 months later, Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep. But his final months had been filled with the recognition and respect he had earned through his military service. At his funeral, the Thunder Road Veterans Club provided another honor guard, and hundreds of people who had been touched by his story came to pay their respects. The viral wedding story had accomplished something that seemed impossible. It had helped heal the wounds that Vietnam veterans had carried for decades, and it had reminded an entire generation about the importance of honoring military service. What had started as a chance encounter on a country road had become a movement of respect and appreciation that touched hearts around the world. Bull continued to lead the Thunder Road Veterans Club, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that day at Rachel and David's wedding. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones you never planned. And sometimes the greatest honor you could give was the simplest act of recognition and respect. The story became a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to act with kindness and honor. It showed that healing was possible, that recognition mattered, and that sometimes all it took to change someone's life was the willingness to see them as the hero they had always been.